A developing story in our nation's capital. Hockey Canada officials were back in the hot seat today. A Commons committee is investigating how the organization handled multiple allegations of sexual assault. Some of those date back decades. MPs want to know why the organization hasn't been more transparent about how it treated the allegations. Scott Smith is the president and chief operating officer of Hockey Canada. Here's some of his opening statement.
Process we followed regarding the incident in London in 2018 was not perfect, but it was intended to ensure that Hockey Canada did not and could not interfere in the investigation. Hockey Canada notified police and engaged an expert firm to conduct an independent investigation that spanned more than 2 years. Reopening the investigation is a step towards addressing the disappointment you and so many feel about the outcomes we followed. Canadians have been clear. They expect those representing our national sport to do better. We recognize that many of the actions we are taking now should have been taken sooner and faster. We own it, and we will do better to deliver on our responsibilities to Canadians.
And the CBC's Janice McGregor is on this story for us live from Ottawa. So Janice, what more have we learned about how Hockey Canada has been handling sexual assault claims?
Well, they had a few numbers for us. They told us that the insurance coverage they have for these kind of claims, they've made about a dozen payments out, totaling about $1.3 million. 4 of those payments apparently all attributed to one perpetrator. No further details about that. But the MPs were really there to ask about this other equity fund that they've been using when sexual assault claims come in, things that are uninsurable. Apparently, that's paid out $7.6 million so far. The majority of that used to help victims of former junior coach Graham James, who is in jail for his assaults on young players, including high-profile advocates like Sheldon Kennedy. I think, though, the most interesting part of the testimony concerned something that isn't covered by those numbers, the separate settlement that was made this spring with the young woman who made an accusation of group sexual assault against players who were on the 2018 World Junior team representing Canada. We learned, and we'll start with issues raised by Liberal MP Anthony Housefather, that they authorized the maximum amount of settlement for her, even though they hadn't completed their own investigation of this, even though they hadn't talked to lawyers representing the 8 players named only as John Doe in her claim, even though there wasn't any kind of definitive process to determine what the facts were, they went ahead and settled with her, something that struck Housefather as extraordinary. Take a listen.
You had a claim and you settled it within 3 weeks or 4 weeks of the date you received the claim. That is highly unusual. Why did you not use the lawsuit as an occasion to depose the plaintiff to see if her claims were credible?
We made the decision to settle in the best interest of the young woman and to respect her privacy. And we did not want to subject her to further discussion or debate that we have now seen through the media in the last 10 to 12 days.
As MPs were pointing out, there were financial incentives for Hockey Canada to want to get this done quickly and quietly, that this would not do the leagues involved any favors, really, to have these kind of claims out there and in the public. I want to also play for you something that the Chief Financial Officer, his name is Brian Cairo, he was asked specifically about why, if they have an insurance policy to cover them, if this kind of a claim is made, why it wasn't used in this case. And here's what he said.
We didn't know all the details of the night, but we did believe harm was caused. We had 2 options. One was basically work with the young lady to arrive at a resolution that met her needs and didn't re-victimize her, or force her to litigate, which likely would reveal her identity and would essentially condone this behavior to Canadians.
But did you catch that? He said, we believe that harm was caused. There was another interesting exchange with Conservative MP Richard Martel. He asked Hockey Canada whether they would allow someone to keep playing if there were suspicions around them. And the answer that came from the head of Hockey Canada was, well, we have this process and people have to cooperate or else they could be banned from hockey. And, authorities must investigate and so on and so forth. But he didn't really answer the question of whether you're allowed to keep playing if there are suspicions around you. And the fact is, in this 2018 case, they did keep playing. Everybody on that team had pro contracts or continued to play in the junior league here in Canada. There weren't consequences for them. The police investigation stopped. The internal investigation stopped until the media came out and brought this to light. They were not on track, any of these players, to face any accountability or any more hard questions about what really happened in that hotel room in London, Ontario. And I think that is why so many people are losing confidence in the leadership of Hockey Canada.
And Janice, another one of the top questions, of course, we saw being asked during the course of this testimony that we heard from the CEO of Hockey Canada, for example, was whether or not the leadership should stay as it is, given the fact that it has carried on and there have been all of these questions about accountability, whether or not they are capable of bringing about change. So how did we hear the CEO of Hockey Canada respond to whether or not he should continue?
Well, he basically asked for more time. He told the MPs that he does care about this issue, that sort of they are getting a plan in place, that they are serious about this and give us some more time to see if this works. But I got to say, as someone who covers Ottawa, it is very rare on a committee to see MPs in agreement, and person after person made the point that they didn't like what they were hearing, that they didn't think this leadership was being accountable, that they thought the leadership needed to change, that it wasn't good enough. We heard questions about why there aren't minutes to document key decisions, why the board wasn't consulted when this 2018 accusation first came up, why it was just handled by a couple of key individuals. Other, leagues told us that they had received some claims, but they weren't reporting these claims to Hockey Canada. People listen to examples like this and they think, what is going on? And I think this committee is going to continue to investigate this, because the impression that was left, even though we've had 2 4-hour meetings, is that there are a lot more questions to ask.
Thanks for this, Janice. That is the CBC's Janice McGregor in Ottawa. So for more on this story, I do want to bring in Katie Strang. She's a senior investigative writer with The Athletic. She's joining us again today from Grand Rapids, Michigan. Welcome. Thank you for making time for us.
Thanks for having me.
So we were listening to a lot of the details that we heard today from the House of Commons Committee, wondering what it was that stood out to you the most when we were learning details about the finances and the settlements paid.
Yeah, this was our first real opportunity to get tangible details about the financials as it relates to the historical ways in which Hockey Canada has dealt with sexual abuse and sexual assault claims. They have, they've paid out and settled 9 claims totaling $7.6 million. That does not include the still undisclosed amount that was paid to the complainant in the 2018 alleged sexual assault. So that is, obviously a pretty significant number. They did note the caveat that 6.8 million of that 7.6 figure is in relation to incidents involving Graham James. So this is the real first time that I think the general public got to sink its teeth into just the scope of the problem and the ways in which Hockey Canada is using funds to deal with it.
One of the overarching questions, too, perhaps going into today's session was the fact that there were some prominent people, Sheldon Kennedy, calling for the CEO and president to step down. And we heard a lot more of that during the House of Commons Committee session, where there were a lot of MPs, too, who were saying, just take a look at who's sitting in front of you. It is a lot of people who look very similar to each other, predominantly white males, and perhaps you could really benefit, they say, from diversifying. So what stood out to you in terms of shifts to leadership and questions surrounding that?
Yeah, both of those things. I think the major takeaway from the day is that there is an increased amount of scrutiny on the homogeneity of Hockey Canada's leadership, including their board and those, witnesses that were on hand to appear and testify today. But also about a culture of silence that seems to persist. Peter Julian did a really nice job of stressing that point, and then also asking, whether Hockey Canada was prepared to release victims and survivors from any historical non-disclosure agreements they might have signed in part and parcel of an agreement. But I think, as Janice referenced, it was quite striking to see so many MPs from multiple different parties really in concert questioning how well equipped the current Hockey Canada leadership is to implement the very change that they say they're committed to making. And so I think in the days that follow, and I do suspect that there will be future hearings, I think there will be more and more questions posed as to whether this current leadership group is fit to lead.
And, important to note, of course, we didn't only hear from the CEO and CFO today. The hearing also involved the commissioners of the major junior hockey leagues, too. And so part of what we heard from them to the committee, that they had also a number of sexual misconduct complaints against players in their leagues, but they didn't inform Hockey Canada about them. So what does that tell you about how hockey at large treats these accusations? You talked about a code of silence.
Yeah, I think there is in hockey largely like a fetishization of stoicism and being very reluctant to call attention to yourself or being a distraction to the team. There's quite a bit of groupthink. I think, players are sort of taught to conform at an early age. And, there's a lot to probably unpack about the billet system and all the different cultural issues that might feed into this. But I think one thing was clear, which is that, the current mechanisms, processes, protocols, procedures in place are not working, and that there is this pervasive sense of silence. So I think, what parliamentarians were truly trying to chip away at today was these very deep-seated cultural and systemic issues. I think the fact that commissioners from, other member leagues as part of the CHL, talking about their own experiences with this, I think that goes to affirm and underscore the fact that this 2018 incident is not an isolated one-off, that this is one example of a more pervasive systemic issue.
And Katie, I did want to get some clarity from you too, because I was able to listen to part of the hearings, but not all of it in its entirety. And some of the questions from reporters too that we saw the leaders of Hockey Canada answer. But we know with Hockey Canada, when it comes to investigations involving sexual assaults, that part of the change is that now it's mandatory for people to participate in those investigations, or they will face stiff consequences, including being essentially banned from all things hockey, so to speak, in an official sense. But there was a question about whether or not that would also apply to other leagues, not just Hockey Canada leagues, and whether or not that would still be the case there, whether those rules would be applied there.
Yeah, I'm not positive about that. And again, that probably goes back to the very corporate governance that sort of governs how Hockey Canada works in concert with the CHL and all the member leagues. But I would certainly say I would expect, an increased level of awareness, if not vigilance, on Hockey Canada and CHL's behalf to, ensure compliance when it comes to investigation or any sort of probe into very egregious, serious matters such as this.
Finally, I did want to ask you, we know that Canada will still participate in the World Juniors in August, and that the committee said it's open to holding more hearings in the fall. So what's next here?
Well, one area that we saw parliamentarians drill down on during the last session was with Barry Lorenzetti, who works for BFL, which is the insurance broker for Hockey Canada, but not the actual insurer. The actual insurer for Hockey Canada on these sexual abuse claims is AIG. So there were quite a few questions that were posed to Lorenzetti that he did not feel either prepared to answer or appropriate for him to answer. that would have probably been more appropriately posed to the insurer and AIG. So I imagine there's probably another, avenue of inquiry to explore as it relates to the insured's relationship. And I wouldn't be shocked if, more reporting continues to prompt more questions that, provides parliamentarians with even more and a wider breadth of questions to pose to Hockey Canada officials as well. I would say one area that I was surprised that was not brought up more was Hockey Canada's decision to exert solicitor-client privilege on quite a few items that Danielle Robitaille brought up in Tuesday's hearings. So I wouldn't be shocked to see parliamentarians circle back on that.
Katie, thank you so much for your insights today. We appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
That was Katie Strang. She's a senior investigative writer with The Athletic, and she joined us today from Grand Rapids, Michigan.